Welcome to Forgotten Ties. Every now and then, life throws a curveball so cruel, so impossibly twisted, that it challenges everything you thought you knew about fate, about family, and about the dark, silent corners of the internet. This isn't just a story about loss. It's a story about a flicker of light in the deepest darkness, a connection found in the most digital, sterile of places, and the horrifying journey that followed. Today, we delve into the life of Clara Hayes, a woman whose quiet, organized world was violently fractured by a single, casual click. Clara, a meticulous archivist in her late 30s, lived a life measured in footnotes and decimal points in suburban Ohio. Her world was quiet, focused, built on the solid bedrock of known facts. She had an aging Labrador named Barnaby, a small, but thriving collection of antique maps, and a past that, while tinged with the familiar melancholy of an absent parent, was largely peaceful. The central vacuum in her family history, the gaping silence, was her Aunt Evelyn. Evelyn Hayes, her mother's younger sister, had vanished almost 25 years ago. Not in a blaze of scandalous drama or a tearful goodbye, but simply gone. The official story, the one whispered at family gatherings and carefully avoided in her mother's presence, was that Evelyn, a brilliant but restless art student in her early 20s, had simply chosen a new life. She had chased a bohemian dream to the West Coast, cutting all ties. But Clara's mother, a woman named Eleanor, never believed it. Eleanor's face, etched with a permanent, subtle pain, was the only proof Clara ever needed that the official narrative was a lie, a comfortable shroud over a festering wound. Evelyn had been vivacious, a whirlwind of unapologetic creativity, with hair the color of midnight and a laugh that could break glass. She was not the type to abandon her life, not without a word, not to her devoted older sister. The irony, the sheer, crushing weight of it, is that Clara wasn't even searching for Evelyn that rainy Tuesday afternoon. She was researching a paper for her local historical society, a deep dive into unsolved cold cases from the 1990s in the tri-state area. She was sifting through the sprawling, chaotic digital archives of a volunteer-run missing persons database, a project maintained by enthusiasts, a place where the officially sanctioned police files met the desperate, unverified pleas of heartbroken relatives. It was a digital graveyard, thousands of faded faces and brief, heartbreaking descriptions, a testament to the fact that so many people simply slip between the cracks of the American tapestry. She was scrolling, her mind numb from the endless parade of tragedy, when a profile image stopped her cold. It was a grainy, low-resolution photo, the kind taken with a cheap film camera. The woman in the photo had an unmistakable, piercing gaze. Her cheekbones were high, her lips full, set in a slight, mysterious smile. The hair, though not quite midnight anymore, was still dark, pulled back haphazardly. It was a younger image, perhaps from a driver's license or a college ID, but the bone structure, the eyes. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. Her meticulously organized world tilted on its axis. She clicked the entry, her fingers trembling, suddenly foreign on the sleek, cold keyboard. The name listed was Jane Doe, case file 98-412. But the description, the details were a hammer blow to her careful facade of emotional distance. The Jane Doe had been found on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, a place completely disconnected from Evelyn's known life in the Midwest. The discovery had occurred in the late fall of 1998, only months after Evelyn's last, brief postcard to Eleanor. The physical description was chillingly specific. Height, 5 feet 6 inches, weight, approximately 130 pounds. Distinctive mark, a small, star-shaped birthmark on the back of the left shoulder blade. Clara froze. The birthmark. She remembered, vividly, a humid summer day when she was a child, watching Evelyn emerge from the community pool, water glistening on her skin. Clara had been fascinated by the tiny, constellation-like mark, asking her aunt if it was a secret tattoo. Evelyn had simply laughed, saying it was her own personal guiding star. It was an intimate detail, one never shared with the general public or listed in any old police report. How could this Jane Doe, found thousands of miles away, have the same unique mark. A wave of nausea washed over Clara. The air in her small study seemed to thicken, the familiar scent of old paper and ink suddenly cloying. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the universe, in its most brutal fashion, handing her the key to the family's oldest, most painful secret. The meticulous archivist knew the rules of evidence. Correlation did not equal causation. But the niece, the woman who remembered the laugh that broke glass, knew better. This was Evelyn. Her missing aunt wasn't living a bohemian dream. Her aunt was a case file, a number, a Jane Doe found in the unforgiving Arizona desert almost 25 years ago. The tragedy wasn't her leaving. The tragedy was her disappearance being misinterpreted as abandonment. And the darkness behind this truth was only just beginning to unfold. The next step, the one that would pull Clara out of her quiet life and into a terrifying, real-world investigation, was inevitable, irreversible, and fraught with peril. A peril she was only beginning to sense, like a cold draft creeping up from a forgotten basement. The file mentioned a few recovered items, seemingly insignificant, but to Clara, they were the last whispers of a life violently silenced. Clara's world didn't just tilt in that moment, it shattered. The comfortable, academic distance she held between herself and the harsh realities of the world evaporated. She was no longer just an archivist reading a case file. She was a niece, a blood relative staring at the horrifying, digitized truth of her aunt's fate. Evelyn hadn't just run away. She had been murdered, or at the very least, died under circumstances so suspicious the authorities couldn't immediately identify her. The Jane Doe, case file 98-412, wasn't a footnote in a historical document. It was a demand for justice. The first, immediate action was a painful, tearful conversation with her mother, Eleanor. But Clara, cautious, still the archivist at heart, didn't lead with the desert body. She started with the star-shaped birthmark, with the grainy photograph, testing the waters. The reaction was exactly what she had feared. Eleanor, a woman who had spent 2 decades meticulously rebuilding her emotional walls, crumbled. The mention of the guiding star birthmark, a secret only the closest family knew, sent her into a fit of raw, guttural sobs. This confirmation, painful as it was, gave Clara the resolve she needed to contact the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office in Arizona. The initial phone call was met with the expected bureaucratic indifference. Case file 98-412 is a cold case, ma'am. We get hundreds of tips a year. The detective on the other end, a weary-sounding man named Miller, was polite but distant. Clara realized she needed more than a hunch and a birthmark. She needed a tie, a physical, undeniable link. She pressed Detective Miller for details on the recovered items mentioned in the brief online summary. This is where the story took its next, sharp, agonizing turn. Miller, after checking the old, microfilmed files, described the items found near the remains. Most were expected: tattered clothing, cheap jewelry. But one item stood out: a small, hand-painted ceramic pin. It depicted a highly stylized, almost abstract image of a crow perched on a lightning-struck oak. "It's a bit unusual," Miller drawled. "Doesn't look like anything mass-produced. Maybe some kind of art project." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. She knew that pin. She knew it intimately. When Evelyn had been in art school, she had gone through a brief, intense phase of ceramics, making small, intricate pins for her entire family. The one she had made for Clara's mother, Eleanor, had the exact same motif, the crow on the lightning oak. It was Evelyn's signature piece at the time, a symbol she had drawn repeatedly, representing her sense of dark, creative defiance. Eleanor had cherished her pin, locking it away after Evelyn's disappearance. The ceramic pin found near Jane Doe 98-412 was indisputably Evelyn's. This wasn't a hunch anymore. This was forensic-level circumstantial evidence. Clara immediately arranged for her mother to ship the sister pin and a sample of Evelyn's DNA, saliva from an old hairbrush Eleanor had meticulously preserved, to Detective Miller. The wheels of the justice system, though rusted by time, had begun to turn again. But the wait for the DNA results was a torment. In that agonizing 2-week period, Clara, unable to simply wait, threw herself into the case file's details. She contacted the volunteer website's administrator, gaining access to the full, unredacted original police reports. What she read was the chilling portrait of the last, desperate months of Evelyn's life. The reports indicated that Jane Doe 98 to 412 was likely in Arizona for only a short period. The medical examiner's report, with its cold, clinical language, suggested the cause of death was blunt force trauma, ruling out a simple accident or natural causes. Evelyn had been murdered. But the biggest shock came from a witness statement in the original file, one so obscure it had been completely ignored. A transient worker, camping miles away, had reported seeing a distressed young woman matching Evelyn's description shortly before the body was found. The worker mentioned the woman was traveling with an older, much larger man, driving an older model, distinctively colored maroon Ford pickup truck with a personalized bumper sticker that read, "Keep honking, I'm reloading." The witness had dismissed the interaction as a domestic dispute, noting the man seemed overly controlling and possessive, frequently arguing with the woman about money and a missing sketch. This seemingly irrelevant detail, ignored in the initial investigation, resonated with a terrifying familiarity in Clara's mind. Why? Because when Clara's mother, Eleanor, finally admitted the whole, agonizing truth, the missing pieces of Evelyn's final months began to snap into place, forming a picture far darker than just a runaway art student. Evelyn hadn't just left. She had been trying to escape. And the man with the maroon truck and the violent bumper sticker? He was very likely the one Evelyn had been desperately trying to leave behind, the terrible secret her mother had hidden for 25 years out of a deep, misplaced sense of shame and fear. The case was no longer just about identifying a body, it was about pursuing a ghost from the past, a violent specter in a maroon pickup truck, who had likely destroyed 2 families. The tension was building, threatening to overwhelm Clara and her mother with its sheer brutality. The sketch, the missing sketch, what was its importance? The DNA results, as heartbreakingly inevitable as they were, finally arrived. Positive match. Jane Doe 98 to 412 was confirmed to be Evelyn Hayes. The 25-year-old mystery was solved, but a new, infinitely more sinister chapter had just opened. Evelyn was gone, violently taken, and her killer had been walking free for decades. The real shift in the investigation, the moment the cold case began to thaw with terrifying speed, came from the secret Eleanor had guarded for so long. Under the weight of her sister's confirmed death, Eleanor finally confessed the full, brutal truth about Evelyn's final year. Evelyn hadn't been a carefree art student. She had fallen in love with a man much older, a charming, charismatic, but ultimately controlling and dangerous figure named Arthur Vance. Vance was a minor league art dealer, a man who preyed on young talent, promising fame and fortune while slowly isolating his victims. Eleanor had vehemently disapproved, seeing the manipulation, the subtle bruises on Evelyn's spirit, long before they appeared on her body. But Evelyn, with the stubborn idealism of youth, had cut Eleanor off. However, a few months before she vanished, Evelyn had returned, briefly, in secret. She was terrified. She told Eleanor that Arthur wasn't just controlling her life. He was involved in something dark, something illegal involving art fraud and potentially stolen pieces. She had found evidence, a specific, detailed sketch Arthur kept hidden. This sketch, Evelyn believed, was a blueprint for a massive forgery, possibly involving a piece from a major museum collection. She had photographed the sketch, keeping the physical photo and the negative hidden, but Arthur had sensed her discovery. She was on the run, not from her family, but from Arthur Vance. Her postcard from the West Coast was a decoy. She had been heading to a safe house of a former art professor, trying to expose Vance. The moment Eleanor spoke the name Arthur Vance, a chilling click echoed in Clara's mind. She remembered the witness statement from the Arizona file, the older, larger man in the maroon Ford pickup. Arthur Vance, Eleanor confirmed, had owned a distinctively colored, older model maroon Ford F-150 at the time, and he was known for his crude, aggressive bumper stickers, a detail Eleanor had blocked out of her mind. Clara, working side by side with Detective Miller, who was now fully invested, realized they had a name, a motive, and a likely suspect. But Vance had vanished almost as completely as Evelyn. His art dealings had dissolved, his known contacts were dead ends, and his last known address was an empty warehouse. The cold case wasn't just cold, it was frozen solid. This is where Clara's expertise as an archivist, her knowledge of digital footprints and obscure databases, became their most powerful weapon. She focused on the maroon Ford pickup, a detail a professional criminal might change, but a sentimental, aggressive man might hold on to. She used niche, specialized search techniques, looking not for a person, but for the truck in public records, old registrations, obscure auto salvage logs, even vintage car forums. Weeks turned into a relentless, exhausting blur. Then, the digital trail led her to a small, dusty town in rural Montana. An older man, fitting Vance's description and age, had recently registered a 1996 Ford F-150 Maroon after moving from Arizona to a remote property outside the town of Whitefish. The personalized license plate on the old registration? Honker. The subtle, digital thread of the Keep Honking sticker had led her directly to him. The terror was palpable. Arthur Vance, the man who had likely killed her aunt and hidden her in the desert, was alive, well, and quietly living off the grid, perhaps believing he had gotten away with the perfect crime. The distance, the time, the desert, it had all served as his shield. But Clara's persistence, driven by grief and a terrifying need for truth, had pierced that shield. She immediately relayed the information to Detective Miller. The process was now in the hands of the authorities, involving a complex interstate jurisdiction, but the emotional climax was for Clara. She had found her aunt, and she had found her aunt's killer. The police in Montana, acting on the warrant filed by Maricopa County, were preparing to move in. But Clara couldn't just wait. She needed to know about the sketch, the motive, the thing that had cost Evelyn her life. She needed to know what Arthur Vance was really hiding. And the answer lay in that small, remote Montana town, waiting to be uncovered. The final, terrifying confrontation was anticlimactic in its speed, but overwhelming in its emotional weight. Arthur Vance was apprehended without incident on his remote Montana property. He was a shell of the charming man Evelyn had fallen for, an aging, bitter recluse surrounded by the silence he had purchased with a life of lies. The case, however, was far from closed. They had the killer, but they still didn't have the full story, the why. What was in that missing sketch that had been worth Evelyn's life? Clara, though physically miles away, was relentless. She returned to the initial police reports, focusing on Evelyn's frantic last weeks, cross-referencing every detail with Eleanor's painful memories of Arthur's art fraud operation. The breakthrough came from a single, overlooked detail in the medical examiner's report. Evelyn's hand, though damaged, had shown faint, dried ink stains, the kind used by technical draftsmen. This suggested that Evelyn hadn't just photographed the sketch, she had been trying to reproduce it, or perhaps correct it. The police, acting on a warrant for Vance's Montana property, located a small, fireproof safe hidden in his workshop. Inside, they found a collection of incriminating documents related to art forgery, several illegal firearms, and the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle, the missing sketch. It wasn't a blueprint for a forgery, it was the forgery itself. The sketch was a preliminary study for a major painting, a presumed lost work of a famous 19th-century American landscape artist. The full-size painting, which Vance had sold years ago for a colossal sum, was hanging in a prominent private collection. Evelyn, a brilliant artist herself, had not only realized the painting was a fake, but she had seen the flaws in Vance's original study and had tried to correct them in her own version, hoping to use the comparison as undeniable proof. Arthur Vance hadn't just killed Evelyn to keep the secret of the forgery. He had killed her because she was a superior artist who could expose his inferior, criminal work. It was a cold, narcissistic act rooted in wounded pride and greed. Her life, her beautiful, creative life, had been reduced to a security risk, to be eliminated like a flaw in a painting. In the ensuing trial, the ceramic pin, the star-shaped birthmark, the DNA, the maroon pickup truck, and finally, the sketch itself, all the seemingly random threads Clara had painstakingly pulled from the digital abyss, were woven into an undeniable tapestry of guilt. Arthur Vance was convicted on all counts. Justice, 25 years delayed, had finally been served. Evelyn Hayes was a Jane Doe no longer. She was a beloved sister, a cherished aunt, and finally, a victim whose truth had been heard. Clara Hayes, the quiet archivist, emerged from the ordeal a changed woman. She had sought a truth that many in her position would have let sleep, and in doing so, she had brought peace to her mother and closure to a decades-old crime. Her journey proved that the forgotten ties of family are never truly severed, not by time, not by distance, and certainly not by the silence of a cold case file. Sometimes, all it takes is a single, persistent soul, scrolling through a digital graveyard, to bring a ghost back into the light. The internet, often a source of distraction and division, became the unexpected tool of divine justice in this most tragic, yet ultimately redemptive story. And so, the story of Evelyn Hayes, the art student who became a Jane Doe, ends not in the desert where her life was taken, but in a courtroom where her name was restored. The quiet dignity of her memory now rests, not under a police file number, but in the hearts of those who loved her. The dark corners of the world are full of secrets like this, full of the missing pieces of lives violently interrupted. But as Clara's story proves, the search must never stop, the questions must never fade. If you are gripped by the horrifying journey of Clara and Evelyn, if this story of a cold case brought back to life resonated with you, there are many more tangled threads of fate waiting to be uncovered right here on Forgotten Ties. Don't let these stories fade away. Like this video to help keep Evelyn's memory alive, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into the unknown, and be sure to hit that notification bell so you can join us the moment we unravel the next chilling mystery. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.